Hello, and welcome to today's ACM Learning webinar. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and serving the over 97,000 computing professionals and students who are ACM's members. I'm Dominic Holt, founder and CEO of a stealth startup centered around DevOps infrastructure that's actually using Angular to build out our product. I'm also VP of Engineering at Salute Incorporated and a member of the ACM Professional Development Committee. You can find more info on my background in the bio widget on your screen. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with ACM or what it has to offer, here is more information. ACM offers educational and professional development resources that bolster skills and enhance career opportunities. Our members can stay competitive in the constantly changing world of computing with a range of ACM Learning Center resources located at learning.acm.org. You can see some of the highlights on your screen. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in a global environment. ACM provides timely computing information published by ACM, including communications of the ACM and Q magazines, access to the ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database of computing literature, international conferences that draw leading experts on a broad spectrum of computing topics, and support for education and research, including curriculum development, teacher training, and the ACM Turing and ACM Prize in Computing Awards. ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technology that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. First, the slides will advance automatically throughout the event. On the bottom panel, you will find a number of additional widgets and resources. If you are experiencing problems with the slides or audio, press the F5 key in Windows, Command R if you're on a Mac, or refresh your browser on a mobile device. Or you can close and relaunch the presentation. To control volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. If you have questions during this webinar, please type them into the Q&A box at any time during the webinar and click the Submit button. I'll organize the questions as Stephen speaks, and he'll reserve time at the end of the presentation to address them. This session is being recorded and will be archived. You will receive an automatic email notification when it becomes available, and check learning.acm.org for updates on this and other upcoming webcasts. At the end of the presentation, you'll see a survey open on your screen. Please take a minute to fill it out to help us improve our webinars. You may also open the link to the survey at any time from the resources window on your screen. Now on to the talk. You can also use the Facebook and Twitter widgets on the bottom panel to share the presentation link with your friends, as well as tweet comments and questions using the hashtag ACM Learning. We'll be watching for your tweets. We also have a new community discourse page to continue the discussion after this webcast, including questions we won't be able to get through during the Q&A session. Today's presentation is Intro to Angular by Stephen Fluin. Stephen is a developer advocate on the Angular team at Google. He works to solve real-world problems faced by developers and businesses and to represent the needs of the community within the Angular team. Stephen, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I'm really excited to be here. So this is an introduction to Angular. Obviously, Angular has kind of a lot of awesome things going on right now, so I won't be able to get to everything. But the goal of the session today is really to give you an overview of a lot of the things we've been working on, some of our kind of core philosophies, how we think about problems, and then dive into a little bit about where we've come from in the last few months in terms of what's new. And then I'll talk a little bit about what's coming in the future, and we'll do a demo along the way to show off some of the cool things you can do with Angular. So as Dominic said, my name is Stephen Fluin. I lead developer relations for the Angular team. And my role on the team really has kind of two directions. So first, in more of an outgoing way, really my role is to help developers and organizations be successful with Angular. And second, it's really to understand what it's like to be a developer day to day, trying to, in many cases, stop thinking about the technology and start thinking about my problem and what I'm trying to achieve. And then we want to reflect all the experiences, successes, challenges that developers have onto the team so that we're making the right sort of decisions as we continue to evolve the platform. So I believe everyone can see my slides, so I'll just keep going. Let me know if there's any problems with that. So I'm going to go through this in a few different sections. First, I'll talk a little bit about what is Angular, make sure that we're all on the same page. Then we'll get into hearing a little bit about the ecosystem and the other parts of the Angular community that make us successful. Then I'll go into a little bit about getting started. I'll actually do a live coding demo. And then we'll talk about the future of Angular and some of the directions that we're going and some of the things we're thinking about. So when I talk about Angular, I use the phrase, Angular is a platform that makes it easy to build applications with the web. And I chose kind of three of these terms very intentionally. And so we talk about Angular being a platform because we're really focusing on the end-to-end developer experience and the journeys, everything from how do I get started with a project to how do I optimize this as I'm scaling it up to hundreds or thousands of developers on a team or on a company. And then also, how do I optimize it from a serving delivery standpoint? So we're not just focusing on one layer of the stack. We're not just focusing on one piece of the problem. I also use the term applications very intentionally because Angular is fantastic at really the orchestration of complex functionality and complex logic to really create these great experiences that are very app-like. And we say with the web, not because the web is the only target for Angular applications. We actually have a bunch of different ways that you can deliver these experiences, but everything Angular does is built on top of your knowledge and experience as web developers. So I think it's really important to reflect on some of the values that the Angular team has. And so we talk about having three values. First is apps that users love to use. So really keeping in mind that the reason that we're all here, the reason we're doing this at all, is to build experiences for users. Second, it's all about applications that developers love to build. So understanding that in order to deliver great user experiences, we have to have great developer experiences. And lastly, a community where everyone feels welcome. And so if you look back at our history with AngularJS and Angular, we were only really successful because we were doing something that people really responded to, and they got engaged and they got involved. And so I'll talk about that as part of the ecosystem. If you're coming from or familiar with AngularJS, you can think about Angular as having some of the same philosophies, but we've dramatically simplified things. So in AngularJS, we had a ton of different directives, ways of doing things. And so we're really focused on kind of simplifying things, making things closer to the native platform. We've definitely designed Angular for scale. So what happened was we ended up having millions of AngularJS developers and hundreds of thousands or millions of AngularJS applications. And as we were doing that, we ended up seeing kind of a lot of common patterns, common challenges. And so we really designed Angular around kind of overcoming a lot of those challenges. And then lastly, we've really kind of reflected on trying to be a part of the modern web. And so understanding, okay, what's happened in JavaScript, what's happened in browsers, and then being effective with that. So this is a piece of Angular code. So this is what we call a template. And you're going to see a lot of very simple things. So we do templating. So we define the view layer of an Angular application declaratively. So this looks a little bit like HTML. You've got div tags, H1s, properties. And then we also have these curly braces for expression interpolation. And then we've got a lot of things like ngIf, ngFor, and the little star there indicates that these are what we call structural directives. And then, which means that you can actually, we're going to stamp out that div tag only if the data is there, and then we're going to stamp out a p tag for every child that's available as part of an array. The other half of an Angular component beyond the template is really just a pure ES2015 class. So you can see here we're doing export class myComponent. That component has a constructor. And then we're doing two things that are a little bit interesting. So at the top, you can see this @component, what's called a decorator. This is what we use to supply additional metadata about what's going on in your application. So for example, you can see here that we are referring this component and saying the template for this component lives in the file component.html. The second thing we're doing here is you see HTTP colon HTTP client. So all Angular applications are built using TypeScript. And so one of the problems that we had in AngularJS is that we weren't very sophisticated in how we helped developers kind of match up their components, their controllers, their templates, these sorts of things. And so you'd get into kind of dumb errors where maybe you had a typo. And so by using the TypeScript system here, we were able to get access to things like decorators. We're able to get access to things like token-based dependency injection, so that we know that we're referring to the right HTTP client, even if there's something called HTTP client in another project somewhere. So we think about Angular as kind of having three core benefits for a lot of modern web developers. Angular is going to try and empower you to move quickly. Angular is going to try and help you scale very smoothly as you grow both your team as well as in terms of number of people, as well as kind of the different roles that can be participating on a team. And we want to help you reach further. So I talked about Angular being built on the modern web. And so one of the things that we've done is we've relied heavily on ES 2015 with the introduction of modules. So you'll see import X from Y kind of all over the place. This gives you file level resolution of what imports you want, what symbols you want available at any point in your application. You're also going to see pure ES 2015 classes. One of the interesting things about Angular is we don't use anything like virtual DOM. We actually try and represent your entire application in the pure JavaScript world using these classes, using your data. And then what we do is we render that out to the screen as a series of instructions. Lastly, we're really trying to push the envelope in terms of the capabilities that are available to developers. And so Angular itself is written in TypeScript. And so we use TypeScript extensively. So TypeScript for developers is actually optional. You only need it for the decorator syntax and the dependency injection that I showed. Everything else you write, you could just write in pure vanilla JavaScript if you wanted to. But what we found is talking to a lot of teams, adopting TypeScript gives you a higher level of reliability and a higher level of kind of intuition about what's going on in an application. It's very easy for a developer to express intent by saying, I'm expecting an object of type of some type. And this becomes especially important when you're doing things like asynchronous programming, where you might have an observable of data or a promise that's going to return some other type of data. And so the typing system ensures that as you're unwrapping various layers of async data, everything works just fine. So let's talk about how we can help developers move fast with integrated tools. So the Angular team, as I talked about, we're really trying to be a platform. And so as part of building out this platform, we've built a set of tools that all work together very well together. So that's everything from a command line environment, a router, HTTP, all these sorts of different tools. And we build them together and we test them so that you know that they're coming from kind of a trusted source. They're coming from the Angular team. And you also know that they are going to continue working together as the platform evolves. One of the side benefits of this is that if you're working on a team and you bring in a new developer, it's very, very likely that they'll know all the same things that you do. And so they can get started very quickly. Now, this opinionation is one of the things that developers really like about Angular, but we at the same time don't want to take away freedom. So if you wanted to do something custom with your router or how you wanted to make HTTP requests, that is absolutely an option. You can swap these things out as you would like. I'm going to dig in a little bit more into a few of these items. And so the first and kind of the top way that a lot of developers interact with Angular, probably over 90% at this point, is via our Angular CLI, which is really designed to automate a lot of the parts of building an Angular application and accelerate your workflow as a developer. If you contrast this with what we did in AngularJS, AngularJS, you could just throw a script tag at the top of the page. But what would happen is if you wanted to go to production, you wanted to minify your application, you wanted to bundle it into a single file, that would actually take a lot of work. You'd have to set up your own gulp scripts, you'd have to set up your own grunt scripts, your build system, et cetera, and you'd have to make a lot of choices. And we're doing a lot of that for you as part of the Angular CLI now. So when you create a brand new Angular project, there's a bunch of different files we're going to give you out of the box, everything from tests to the build system. And what I've seen is that Angular projects day one tend to look like AngularJS projects looked after a month or two of development. And so this really kind of echoes back to this idea of making developers more effective. Within the CLI, we have a bunch of different awesome commands. So you can ng new, which creates a brand new project. You can ng generate, which will add a component or a module to an existing project. You can ng serve to get a live development environment, ng build to get a minified, uglified, bundled, chunked build that you can then ship into any sort of production server you want. We've got a couple cool new commands that we introduced as part of our 6.0 release in the last couple of months called ng add and ng update. ng add is really exciting because it allows you to add new capabilities from third parties to your application much faster. And ng update is really cool in terms of the way that it allows you to stay up to date as Angular evolves and as all of your dependencies evolve. So most of these commands like ng new, generate, add, update are built on a system that we call schematics. And schematics, you can really think of it as an open platform for modifying projects in a very standardized, predictable way. So when you run ng new, we're going to take a blank tree structure or blank folder, and we're going to return a fully scaffolded out Angular application. When you run ng generate component, we're not only going to create a folder for the component, we're going to create the component, the HTML, the TypeScript, the tests for that component, but we're also going to update other parts of your application and fix the references. You can see this again using ng update, for example, where not only are we going to update your dependencies and third parties, we can actually update your code to keep up to date with those dependencies. And this is actually a big shift to something that hasn't been done in the ecosystem before too much. So for example, when you if you ng updated Angular material to the latest version, as part of that update, we actually deprecated it and renamed a couple older APIs. But what we did is because we built a schematic and we tapped into these ng update powers, we can actually update your code for you. And so that as a developer, you wouldn't even see the change in most cases. We've also built tools that try and handle a lot of common tasks. So one of the most common tasks in web development is mapping URL state into the capabilities and features that you want to be showing and the state of your application. And so we have a router that's capable of doing a lot of different things, such as auxiliary routes, such as child routes, all those sorts of kind of powers that a lot of developers expect. We actually worked heavily with the community when we were building that out. We have an HTTP library that instead of giving you back just a set of data, can actually give you an observable of data. And this is really powerful for a number of different reasons. We also have a set of forms tools because often when we're building applications, collecting data is not just a one-way conversation. It really should be two ways, where as a user is filling out the form, we're giving them feedback. We're saying, yes, you did this field right. We need additional information over here. Maybe the username that you chose isn't valid. So we've got a lot of tools that turn forms into this nice two-way conversation with the user. Animations are a really part of building web applications that we actually don't see a lot of developers taking advantage of. And so we spent a lot of time trying to make it easy to do animations based on state transitions. So whether that's a user doing something in the application, or whether that's moving around the different routes in the hierarchy of the application, we want to make it easy to create these sorts of beautiful animations. And a lot of people think this is just because you want to have visual delight or maybe branding, but it actually goes much further than that. Animations are very important for a few different reasons. Animations are really powerful and really important in terms of giving the user clues and hints about what's going on in the experience of the application. So for example, if you are descending and ascending a hierarchy in your application, using animations that swipe left or right, for example, to visually indicate where the user is in the application makes the entire thing more intuitable. It makes it easier to understand what's going on at any given point. At Google, we care a lot about building applications that scale to lots of different users and large audience groups. So we have a lot of internationalization capabilities. Currently, these are at runtime, or excuse me, these are at build time, but we're working on adding runtime internationalization capabilities. But in general, you can just add an attribute like IETN or IETN placeholder if you want to internationalize one of the attributes on an HTML tag. And then what we can do is we can extract those at build time into a industry standard XLIF file or a couple others, which then you can pass to a translation house or do the translation. And then you pass that back in as part of the build process, and you get a fully internationalized version of the site without any sort of overhead at runtime. We also want to help developers build better code. And so we've built a couple things in kind of from scratch. So first, testing is a very important discipline that builds higher quality applications, more maintainable applications. Testing becomes important when you have a project with multiple developers or a project that exists for any period of time. I like to say that even if you are a single developer on a project, after about 6 months, you are effectively 2 developers because you're never going to remember what you were doing 6 months ago. And so having tests can be very important to build kind of defensive code and to ensure that you're not breaking any part of your application as it continues to get more complex. And we actually manifest this with both unit tests and end-to-end tests when we do an ng new for creating a new project or when we ng generate a piece of a project. Another piece that helps you build better code is we've built a set of language services that integrate with IDEs that actually give you a more semantic understanding of what's going on in the app. So for example, when you're editing one of those HTML templates, because we know the TypeScript component it's associated with, we can actually ensure that you don't refer to something that doesn't exist. And we can give you type and autocomplete directly within HTML that refers to your code. And so this is a really powerful capability that ensures that developers are more effective at writing good code. We have another set of tools called Angular Universal, which is for server-side rendering. So with server-side rendering, you basically run the entire Angular application on the server, figure out what HTML would result as a result of running the application, and then we send that down to the user. And then what we do is we bootstrap Angular on top of that. And so this is trying to give the users the best of fast performance and giving them kind of more static HTML with the great client-side experiences that we can deliver with single-page applications and with technologies like Angular. And so by using something like Universal, you're going to get machine-readable URL or HTML that can be parsed by something like a crawler or a social share tool like Facebook or Twitter. And we're also going to improve the performance that users perceive. Another fantastic set of tools we have is the Angular Material Library and the CDK or Component Dev Kit. So Angular Material takes Google's material design philosophy and manifests it as a set of ready-to-use components. So it's very easy to get up to speed very quickly with a good-looking application that follows a lot of great best practices for usability. And as we were building out Angular Material, we ended up seeing that we were solving a lot of problems that developers were having. And so we started building out the component dev kit, which actually forms the core of Angular Material. And this is really just common patterns and behaviors that you might want to add to your application. So an example of this might be if you wanted to create an overlay, or if you wanted to use some of the accessibility tooling we've built, or support bidirectional rendering. All of these are capabilities that we have built in. The CDK is also really important because it allows developers of other component libraries to move much faster. So we've got this integrated set of tools. We've got developers writing better code. We also want to help people build maintainable applications as they scale. And so our opinionated approach definitely helps with that. Our use of TypeScript for expressing intent helps with that. Our huge focus on testing is very helpful. And then as I talked about schematics, you can think about, hey, if we're building a component library and we need to make a breaking change, we can actually now, using something like schematics, help our developers keep up with our changes or adopt our tools more quickly. But not only as you're scaling out in terms of number of users, we also care about collaboration across different teams. So often we'll see that you'll have teams that include architects, developers, designers, and a lot of different roles. And so we've thought about this as part of Angular, and we've mapped that into a lot of our concepts. So for example, architects can often focus on the ng module or the module layout of an application to really understand kind of what's the critical path and what are the paths that users are going to follow through our app. Developers can focus more on the component layer or kind of the individual experience or the individual screen or component capabilities. And then we even want to involve designers. And so having isolated HTML means that if a designer knows some HTML, they can actually get in and make tweaks directly in the same code base. And that's something I'll talk a little bit more about later. So we also want developers to be able to reach further. So we started this talk reflecting on how Angular uses a web developer skill set, but we don't just deliver experiences via the web anymore. So there's things like PWAs or progressive web applications, where we're seeing new and more powerful APIs landing in browsers so that you can build experiences such as offline or notifications. So PWAs are really enabled by a bunch of different APIs in the browser. The one in particular that's kind of most interesting is called Service Worker. And a service worker as part of your application can actually proxy every request to your app. And so if the user's laptop or phone is offline, you can actually respond with a cached version of your app. And so users can keep using your web app even without internet connection. And this is a really powerful capability. And we actually have an ng-add schematic for this. If you ng-add @angular/PWA, we'll automatically set up and configure a service worker for you, and your app will, as long as you've architected your data in the right way, your app will just start working offline. We also have a partnership with NativeScript. So NativeScript is another team that allows you to use JavaScript to render, instead of to HTML into the web via a browser, you actually render to native UI widgets on Android and iOS. And so NativeScript allows you to use the same application layer, all the same components, logic, change detection, services, but then instead of rendering to HTML, you can render to the mobile device, which is really exciting. There's also a tool out there called Electron, which allows you to package web applications and single-page apps as a desktop application. And so this is what VS Code uses. There's lots of tools that use Electron, and we've seen and heard about a lot of awesome results using Electron. And the last piece that I'll talk about is Angular Elements, which is one of the new projects that we shipped as part of 6.0. So the core idea behind Angular Elements is to take Angular components that we're already building as part of an Angular application, and then package them as custom elements in an Angular context. Custom Elements is a web standard for componentry that, instead of using a framework to do the bootstrapping, it actually uses native browser machinery. And so if you're building something like a content management system, we do this on Angular IO. Historically, due to the security separation between code and content, it was actually very hard to dynamically bootstrap things that were defined at runtime. But using Angular Elements, we are allowed to use the browser machinery to kind of pierce that boundary in a very safe, controlled, understandable manner. And so you can now embed kind of live functionality directly within content or within HTML that's being defined at runtime. And so this is a very powerful capability. And we're looking at Angular Elements in the future as an initiative that we're spending a lot of time on, because we'd love you to be able to bundle your Angular components as redistributable pieces that other teams could use, even if they're not using Angular. So I want to talk just a little bit about the Angular ecosystem. The Angular ecosystem and the community is growing hugely fast. So at the end of last year, we just passed 1 million 30-day active users, and it actually passed AngularJS. So it's actually very hard for us to measure how many people are using Angular, because from anecdotal conversations, around 90% of the Angular apps are built behind the firewall. So line of business, employee-only apps, or internal tools for customers and partners. And so we can't actually see any of those applications in the public. And so what we do is we use our 30-day active users to Angular.io as a stand-in for those metrics and for that data. And actually earlier this year, we passed 1.25 million. So our growth is just kind of exploding, and we're really happy to see so many developers taking advantage of Angular. Angular is definitely open source. So every line of code originates as a pull request in GitHub. So whether you're on the team, whether you're an open source contributor, everyone goes through the same path and has to go through the same quality checks. And so we try and be very open about everything we're doing. And so the process generally is you create a PR, you make sure you have tests, and then we have a caretaker process that reviews this. And then what we do is, before we actually merge that commit, we validate that commit against 700 plus projects at Google. And so Google has all of our source code in a single repository, and we only allow one version of Angular. And so the 700 plus projects at Google that are using Angular are always on the latest commit, and so that we have very high assurances that any commit that makes it into our repository is going to keep working. So we actually see a lot of companies not just using our releases, but using every commit that we make to our repository. Last year, just another statistic for you, I think it was something like 40% of the Angular code base, or the Angular commits, were written by the community, which is really awesome to see. Angular is obviously more than Google. So Google definitely extensively uses Angular for a lot of different projects, like Google Shopping Express, Google Cloud Platform, Firebase, these sorts of things. But there's a kind of worldwide community of authors, services, builders creating things like libraries. We've also built deep partnerships with a lot of kind of community projects. So I talked a little bit about NativeScript, but we also work a lot with Webpack. So for example, as part of their recent 4.0 release, we were working with them to make sure that it would work in Angular as soon as we cut our next release. We use RxJS, or kind of reactive extensions for JavaScript, extensively as part of Angular. And we're working very closely with the StackBlitz folks to make it easier to get started with Angular. When we ask developers why they use Angular, we hear about kind of 5 things most often. I talked a lot about how we are opinionated, and that's actually the #1 thing that we hear from people. We also hear that the Angular team is trustworthy in terms of we have a publicly scheduled release plan. We kind of do what we're going to say, or we do what we said we would do. Angular is definitely scaled both in terms of users, developers, and kind of various collaborative teams. Angular is familiar. About half the people that are learning Angular are coming from AngularJS, which has all the same philosophies. But the other half are coming from .NET and Java and traditional backend technologies, where they appreciate this kind of application mentality. And lastly, people choose Angular because we have an awesome community. We have over 790 Angular meetup groups around the world. So kind of no matter where you are, there's probably a meetup near you and a great community that we recommend you tap into and get connected with. So if you're looking at getting started with Angular, there's kind of 2 paths that I'd recommend. If you already have NPM or Yarn installed, you can globally add our Angular CLI and then run ng new myapp. Or if you're just looking to get your feet wet, there is a great site called stackblitz.com. And if you just click on Angular, you'll see that it will kind of spin up in the browser without installing anything, a application that's ready to go and ready to get edited. So I want to go ahead and go through a demo. We'll see how much time we've got here, how far we'll get. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build out an Angular application. I want to fetch data from the internet. I'm going to code split and lazy load. So I want to do some of these kind of more advanced web technologies that the Angular team is trying to make easy. If we have time, we'll try out some material components as part of our 6.0 release. And there's lots more things we can show, which we probably will not have time for. So I'm going to jump over to a set of code here. So right before this meeting, or right before this call, I went ahead and I ran ng new, and I created ACM app. And so this scaffolded out all of the different things I would need for a basic application. You can see we've got end-to-end tests, we've got all of our dependencies, we've got a tsconfig, we've got unit tests, and then most of the things that new developers are going to care about are in this source/app folder. So you've got a component. So you can see this is a lot of static HTML with some interpolation here. And then you've got a module, which from an architectural perspective, kind of brings all these things together. And so I'm going to show you a couple of things. So I'm going to use our CLI here to actually run a new command, and I'm going to create a new component. So I'm going to ng generate a component, and we're going to call this component home. So again, this is going to just create the test. It's going to create the reference to the module. And now I can go and use that component in my application. So if I delete everything that comes by default here in my HTML, I can say app home. We should see home works. So that's what we create by default. And then I'm also going to go ahead and create a new module. So I'm going to ng generate module about. This is a new architectural chunk of my application. And so if we go into source/app/about, we can see that we've got the new module here. And what I can do is I can ng generate a new component called about. And what the CLI will do is it will see we're in the about folder, we're in the about module, and it will automatically attach it to that about module. And so now let's go ahead and actually jump into that home component, and let's collect some data from the internet. And so if I want to collect data, I need the HTTP client. So I'm going to import the HTTP client module, /common HTTP. Close that out so everyone can see. And then I'm going to go ahead and import that client module. What this does is now we've set up the HTTP client, so then in any component we want, we can now actually make requests. So I'm going to go into the home component here, and I'm going to create a handle using dependency injection on the HTTP client. Should import the right one. And then what I can do is, for example, let's say we want to fetch a list of repositories from GitHub. So I can say repos. So I'll just create a local variable on the class. And then I'll say this.repos equals http.get. And we'll give it a type so that we know exactly what we're getting back from the server. and then we'll point it at a path. So let's make sure we get the path right. So I'm going to just try this out. I think it's https api.github.com/search/repositories !q equals Angular. If I'm remembering that correctly, this is returning a JSON blob, which is a search result, and it has in it all of the items. So what we can do is just set the path equal to that. And then this defines an observable. And what we can do here is we can actually unwrap that observable using something like the pipe operator, and then taking the data and turning it into data.items. And so what this will do is, as we talked about, the object is not actually the shape we want. And so we want to take this object and we want to instead turn it into an array. I'm going to import map from RxJS operators. So now we've defined an observable, but no one's actually listening to this observable. So if I visit the web page, it's not actually going to kick off a web request at all. But what I can do in my home components HTML now is I can replace homeworks, and I can say div ng4 equals let repo of repos pipe async. And what's going to happen is this async pipe is going to automatically unwrap that observable, and every time it emits a new value when the HTTP request completes, it's going to get that value, and then we're going to create a div for each item. And so then let's just do repo.name. And let's see what I've messed up as part of this demo here. So if we go back to our app, actually I didn't mess anything up. Everything, it came through just fine. So under the hood, we've got now in our home component, we have a list of repositories that match the name Angular. And they're all rendering here as separate divs. So the next thing I want to do is I'm actually going to add the router. And so we're going to jump back to our module here, and I'm going to import the router module. We're going to need to import that as well from @angular/router. And the router module is something that we are going to configure. So we're going to configure that for root. We're going to give it an array of paths. So maybe one path should be blank for our home path, and then we'll point that at the home component. And then we'll create another path where instead of synchronously referring to the about component, I'm actually going to say load children. And I'm going to point it at about/about.module, about module. And so this is the magic of where we do lazy loading. So instead of referring to it synchronously, I'm going to use a string to refer to it, which then the CLI knows to split this code out into a separate chunk and then load it only on demand. So if we want to take advantage of this, we need to add the router to the about module real quick. So here we will import the router module as well. And we're going to configure it as a child route. Whoops. Again, we're going to give it an array of paths, and this time it's going to be synchronously for any path here. I'm going to synchronously refer to the about component because this module has been lazy loaded. So the next step that we have to do is in our app component, instead of referring app to app home directly, we're going to create a router outlet. And this router outlet is what's going to interact with the router to decide what to render on the screen at any given time. And just so that we can get around, let's create a couple A tags here. So let's call this the home tag, and we'll copy and paste this, make an about route. So again, if I've done that correctly, what we should see is home and about. And by default, we're routing to the home path, as you can see, because we left that for the empty path. And if we look in the network tab here, we'll see something very important when we click on about. So when I click on about, it loads the component, it renders it via the router. But you'll notice that this code actually came from the network. So none of this code was needed to load at the beginning. None of this was coming from the critical path. And so this is kind of the magic of lazy loading, where I can build a very large application, but only make my user pay for the pieces that they need at the very beginning. So one last thing I'm going to show in the last kind of minute we've got here. I'm going to go back to the root here, and I'm going to show you ng-add. So you can ng-add something like @angular/material. This is going to go ahead and download @angular/material from NPM. or whatever package manager you use. And then it's going to automatically configure my project to use Angular Material. And so one of the things that comes along with that is a set of schematics that are from Angular Material. And the way that we can take advantage of this is I'm going to generate a component, something like a material dashboard, or a material sidebar and a navigation table, all these sorts of starter components, and get something out of the box that kind of fully works. So now I'm going to run ng generate. Instead of component, I'm going to say @angular/material, but mat dash. I'm going to give it a name. It's mat dashboard, actually. Dash. Maybe it was mat dash. Let's try one different one. I think I'm just forgetting one of the names, so we'll go ahead and skip that part of the demo because we are out of time anyway. But these starter components, you can read all about them on blog.angular.io, and you can kind of see a fully configured app using Material, using these sorts of things. So I will just do a very brief debrief about the future. We care a lot about designers, and so we're working hard to build new tools that make designers more powerful. For example, we announced at NGConf this year a cloud prototyping tool that the Google Cloud team is working on that uses Angular components. They just posted an update on our blog. And then there's a new project ongoing here that is not yet ready, and it's not going to be ready for a few months, called Ivy, which actually inverts how we render code. Where instead of the renderer pointing to your code actually pulls in the renderer. And the net effect of this is that your application bundles can be much, much smaller, and you only pay for the features that you use. So we've actually now gotten a Hello World down to around 2.7 KB because Hello World doesn't really need that many features, so we can leave out dependency injection, we can leave out pipes, directives, all these sorts of capabilities. So right now we're still working on the runtime and the template compiler. At some point in the future, we'll get to a verification stage, both within Google and across other apps, because we want this update to be 100% backward compatibility. And when it's ready, then we'll kind of automatically turn it on for all developers. And so Angular is really focused on this idea of having the best of stability and innovation. So we want you to keep writing the same Angular apps, but we're going to keep making your application better and take your application further. Thank you so much. The slides are on bit.ly ACM Angular, and we've got a survey up on bit.ly/Stephen Survey. And then let's jump into the Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen, for giving us that talk. It was really great. That was really interesting. The first question, somebody wants to know, what do you mean by opinionated in regards to Angular?
Sure. So Angular is opinionated because we come with kind of an answer for every question you might have. So when you say, how should I create a new project? We're going to say, use the CLI. If you're going to say, hey, how should I fetch data from the web? Use our HTTP client. And so we have all these things out of the box, whereas often with other libraries, other frameworks, you would have to go out kind of across the web. You'd Google search, what should I use to make an HTTP request? What should I use for testing? But we've kind of included all of these things in the box with a great default.
Okay, great. Would you please comment on backward compatibility? After Angular 1 changing to Angular 2 broke many things. Now we have Angular 6. This person has a long-time project, wants to know when Angular 7 comes out, if they won't have to make much code changes in their project.
Sure. So between AngularJS or 1.x and Angular or kind of 2.0 and beyond, we did rewrite the framework kind of using the same philosophies built on the modern web. And so there were a lot of breaking changes, a lot of incompatibilities between AngularJS and Angular. We do have an upgrade path with something called ng upgrade. And this is something we're helping developers kind of get on board with. We actually have a team member joining us this summer to work exclusively on moving developers from AngularJS to Angular. But ever since kind of September of 2016, with the kind of release of Angular, we've been very focused on giving developers a high level of stability. And so as of the latest release of Angular, so which was version 6, what we saw was that the majority of Angular developers are actually on the latest version. And so we feel like we've been very successful in terms of not breaking people or giving people tools to stay up to date. And this is something that we're investing even more time in with something like ng update, where if we for some reason do have to make a breaking change, we want to fix your code for you in an automatic way whenever possible.
Great. So a lot of people want to know what is Google's stance on supporting AngularJS, and how does that relate to Angular development going forward?
Sure. So we announced that AngularJS, we called it AngularJS is now stable. I think we just released either RC or final. I forget which stage we're at, but 1.7 of AngularJS. And we're going to do a little bit more bug fixing and development. But in general, AngularJS is kind of, so to say, complete, right? Everything works. We've got both the common cases, the medium cases, and the really complex cases. Everything kind of works in the way that AngularJS does things. And so we announced a long-term support plan of where if there's any sort of changes to how the browsers work or any critical security problem, we would fix those for the next 3 years.
Okay, great. Someone wants to know, can you please elaborate on how Angular server-side rendering works?
Sure. So what we do is we use, because all of Angular runs in the pure JavaScript layer and is not actually, we don't have to require a browser at all to run an Angular application or to do change detection. We're able to use something like Node or the V8 engine to run your Angular application, and then we wait for it to be stable, and then we do a server-side rendering instead of an HTML or instead of a browser rendering, which gives you a set of static HTML that then you can ship down to the browser. So this is in use at companies like Forbes. So if you go to Forbes.com and look at any article on desktop, that is a server-side rendered application where they run the Angular app on the server to figure out what it should look like. And then they bootstrap Angular on top of that to get a rich client-side experience.
Great. I think you touched upon this a little bit, but a lot of people want to know, what is the future of Angular? Where is Google headed with Angular?
Sure. So the Google team is investing a lot in Angular, making it better for developers, trying to kind of bring the best of Google to the world. And so this is something that we're continuing to work on. You see us at a lot of conferences. We're working extensively. The number of projects at Google keeps going up. So I would say Angular continues to be more and more important to Google. And at this point, I think I said we were over 700 different projects within Google that are using Angular. Now, most of those are not public-facing, not the size or complexity of something like Firebase or Google Cloud Platform. But obviously, a company like, or any big company takes a lot of software to run. It's how people get paid. It's how people log time. Those sorts of things are via tools built in Angular.
A lot of beginners here, Stephen, want to know how you suggest getting started with Angular. Any good online courses?
Yeah, we actually have an awesome community. So if you take a look at angular.io/resources, we have a lot of different companies that will do training. We have a lot of different books on Angular. We have a lot of online tools and training. One of the first places I'd recommend you take a look is just go to angular.io, because on there we have a getting started guide. We have a tutorial that walks you through a lot of these kind of very cool concepts. But if one of those things doesn't match your learning style, as I said, we have a huge community that's on Udemy, they're on Coursera, they're on Pluralsight, building fantastic content as well.
There's someone who wants to know if there's any API tooling between the Go language and Angular.
So there is not. I've heard of people building tools in Go to do some of this server-side rendering to spin up the V8 engine and things like that, but nothing we build requires the use of Go. If you look forward to this idea of a standardized set of instructions after the Project Ivy lands, you could theoretically, I'm not recommending this, but you could theoretically compile another language into an Angular component. But those are just kind of some of the crazier ideas that are flying around from some of our community members.
So this is a good question for beginners. What's the main differences between Vue.js, React, and Angular?
Sure. So I would say really we're trying to solve different problems. So there's lots of really great tools for building these web-based experiences. But for example, we're really trying to be more than a library, more than a framework, all the way to platform, where we try and take care of the kind of end-to-end developer experience. And so we spend a lot of time worrying about how do developers bundle these things, how do developers get started. And so that's a big focus for us. Whereas a lot of other tools out there, it's more of an open ecosystem, kind of choose your own adventure, where you pick a bunch of different ingredients, you pull them together, and then everything works.
Great. Someone wants to know what the best way to contribute directly to Angular is.
Sure. So one of our community members, a company called ThisDot, actually ran something called Angular Contributor Day. I think it was about a week ago. And so if you Google online for Angular Contributor Day, there was a 3 or 4 hour session where we brought in different community contributors, people that were building libraries, people that were teaching Angular, people that were consulting on Angular. And so we really look to a lot of those community members as examples of how to do these sorts of things in the community. If you're just looking to get started contributing to the Angular code base, I would say definitely look at building a library. So building a component library that takes something unique that you want, a problem you want to solve. Hopefully not another date picker, but if that's what you want to build, go for it. And then kind of contribute that to the world, put it on NPM, talk about it on GitHub, and share that with the world. If you want to contribute more directly to Angular itself, in our GitHub repo, so that's github.com/angular/angular, we have a label called Angular Community Hot List. So you could take a look at the community hot list and say, hey, are there any easy issues that I can fix? And the last recommendation I would do is we have all of our documentation is public. It's in the same repository as Angular. And so if you go into Angular/Angular in the AIO folder, which stands for Angular.io, you'll see all of our documentation. You'll see all of our content. Definitely feel free to get involved and add something, ask for changes, those sorts of things. I've often seen developers that are getting up to speed on a project. Getting into the documentation first is a great way to get started.
Okay. Next question is, folks want to know, what is the easiest way to move from AngularJS to Angular?
Sure. So it depends on your project, but one of the easiest ways is using something called ng upgrade. And so what ng upgrade does is it basically allows you to bootstrap AngularJS and Angular so that you can do an incremental migration, right? So I start with 100% of my components being in services being AngularJS, and then maybe I do all of my new development in Angular, but I can still use all of my old AngularJS components. And so it allows you to kind of use both of them flexibly as you are writing new code or as you're migrating.
Great. There's a lot of questions around test-driven development. Do you have any recommendations for how to learn about test-driven development with Angular, or how it should be done?
Sure. So as I said, testing is kind of a very core part to our strategy. So I don't know if you can still see my screen, but if you jump back to this project that I was creating as we went, you'll notice that every single file that or every single kind of thing that I created has this spec file. And so if you're a fan of testing, not only do we give you a bunch of tests out of the box just to make sure that the app is able to start up and that it has kind of the basic content you're expecting, this also serves as an example. So if you wanted to define a bunch of other tests, you can kind of see, hey, I want to make sure that not just that there's an H1, but that there's a button, and when you click on the button, this other thing happens. So Angular testing is key to a lot of the things we do. So for example, there's a really interesting story at Google how everyone is expected to test because we keep all of our code in a single code repository, and basically anyone at Google can modify anyone else's code. But the rule is, if I break your code and you don't have a test, right? Like I don't make any of your tests invalid, then you have to fix it. Whereas if I change something and I break your code and I make one of your tests fail, I have to fix it. And so this actually gives both everyone kind of an incentive to test and to make sure that their application is very reliable. But it also gives the Angular team a very, very strong incentive to make sure that we don't do any breaking changes. Because at this point, if we wanted to push through a breaking change, we would have to fix over 700 applications. And so as a team, we both don't want to make breaking changes, or when we do want to make a breaking change, we want to automate those changes so that everyone can take advantage of them.
Great, Stephen. So next question is, why should lots of different types of developers move to Angular? GWT, jQuery, you name it. What's the reason to leap?
Sure. So I'll kind of broaden the question. So there's a lot of JavaScript developers who love Angular and want to move to Angular because of its kind of structural and architectural and best practices guidance. So I've actually heard from more than a handful of developers who thanked us for kind of pushing them into Angular because they fell in love with TypeScript, they fell in love with one-way data flows, they fell in love with the component-based way of building things. If you contrast Angular with jQuery, for example, with jQuery, you make one manipulation to the page at a time, right? So I hide something, I show something, I load a piece of data, and what ends up happening when you build a really complex app is that what you do in one place affects almost every other place. So let's say a sign-in experience. And those things end up becoming a nightmare to manage with something like jQuery. But with Angular, because we have this application mentality, we have change detection, all these sorts of things, you could have a sign-in button that then makes the entire page change, maybe edit buttons show up all over the page without a reload, without any user interaction. And it creates a really good user experience. And user experience is why I would say developers are kind of flocking from backend technologies to something like Angular, because with a backend technology, there's necessarily a latency. The user has to wait every time they click, every time they do an action, every time they want data. The user has to wait. And waiting actually kills productivity because of task switching. The American Psychology Institute, I think, or American Psychology Association, something like that. They did a study and they found that in a given day, 40% of someone's time is wasted by task switching. And so if you can build an application that doesn't require task switching, where everything they do has an optimistic UI and they feel like it's responding instantly, they're going to be much happier users and they're going to be much more effective and productive.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. How scalable is server-side rendering?
It's very scalable. So, I mean, I mentioned Forbes.com was actually one of the first users of it. The key to scaling that is really all about how you want to do your caching layer. So, for example, are you generating a static version that every user can visit? And then you can cache that and just send out the same static content to everyone? Or are you doing something where you're regenerating it for every user based on their context, based on their given application state? That's obviously a much more complex problem. Or what we see at a lot of big companies is that they'll use Angular Universal to render parts of the page and they'll reassemble it with other static HTML from other parts. And so that's something that's very cacheable, right? Because the Forbes.com article content doesn't change for anyone, but the toolbar might, the footer, some of those sorts of things will change.
All right, Stephen. Well, thank you so much for giving a presentation and for answering all those questions. I'm afraid we've run out of time today. I'd like to thank Stephen again for his informative presentation and insightful answers to the many questions. A special thanks to each of you for taking the time to attend and participate today. This webinar was recorded and will be available online in a few days at webinar.acm.org. You can find announcements on upcoming webinars and other ACM activities at learning.acm.org and acm.org. Also, please fill out ACM's quick survey where you can suggest future topics or speakers, which you should see on your screen. On behalf of the ACM, Stephen Fuen, and myself, Dominic Holt, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you will join us again in the future. This concludes the webinar.